Well, thanks very much, Pascal, for your welcome. Steve Martin, your chairman, it's wonderful to catch up with him again. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives when I was an MP, and he's presiding over me here, and he presided over me there, often, you know, censuring me for doing the wrong thing as an MP. Let me start by saying it's a huge pleasure, it really is, for me to be back in Adelaide again. That sense of warmth that you get from being home is simply wonderful. I don't want to say anything that could be interpreted as critical of the United Kingdom, being the Australian representative to the United Kingdom, except to say that when it comes to lifestyle, as somebody said this week, Australia is a superpower. And you get that feeling driving around Adelaide this morning. It's so easy to move around. I used to think the bus lanes on Grenfell Street were terribly irritating, but have you ever tried London bus lanes? That's something completely different. These days, Brexit, as well as the election of Donald Trump, and as Pascal was saying, the possibility of the election of Marine Le Pen in France and various other phenomenon, are interpreted by the media as a decline in public support for globalisation and a sense that the world is becoming increasingly unequal and increasingly unfair, and that the dispossessed are now turning to populist leaders and abandoning what has apparently seen to be a kind of liberal elite consensus on how the world should be run. I basically run a counter-narrative on this. I myself don't think that this interpretation of what is happening in the world is anything like accurate. And I would say, sort of rather profoundly, that when people are making decisions about how to deal with the issues of the day, they need to do so in a context where they accurately analyse what's actually going on. What I think is actually going on is that where governments or international organisations do not perform well, they are likely to be punished by a public that thinks they should be doing better. And underlying a lot of this debate is an assumption that people should be supporting politicians and institutions for the sake of supporting them, rather than supporting them on the basis of a job well done. Let me explain what I mean in the context of Brexit. People in the United Kingdom did not vote to leave the European Union because they wanted to pull up the shutters and to turn Britain into an entirely isolated country cut off from the rest of the world. That is not in the British nature. Britain is an open and outward-looking country. It is not a country that is scared of engaging with the world or has suddenly decided, obviously you know that, but it's not a country that has suddenly decided to disengage from the world. The European Union, created in 1957 as the EEC, you'll recall, did not include the UK up until 1973. Britain was, in a way, a reluctant joiner. And has been a reluctant member of the European Union ever since. Late to join, unenthusiastically joined, but joined because the British government at the time and the British Parliament thought that France and Germany, coming out of the Second World War, were doing better than Britain, and perhaps Britain would therefore be better off joining in with them in a transactional relationship, in a trade and investment relationship, but not as part of a project to build a great and united Europe. That was not so much the British argument. That is absolutely the perspective of Germany and France, that they are trying to create a completely new Europe and a new paradigm for Europe, a new philosophy for Europe. For the British, their entry into the EEC and the European Union was essentially more transactional, as people like to say. Their experience in the European Union since 1973 has been, to be frank, unenthusiastic. They didn't join the euro, they didn't sign the social the social charter of the European Union. They didn't join the free movement of people arrangement known as the Schengen arrangement, where you have just a common border around the countries that belong to this Schengen arrangement. They have been very much a country which has stood away from the mainstream integrationist ambition of the European Union. So when the European Union talks about ever closer union, the British have always said, not for us, ever closer union. We have a more transactional relationship with the European Union. When it came to the referendum campaign 9 months ago, the debate in the United Kingdom was entirely a debate about whether the British people would be economically better off inside or outside the European Union, and whether the British people should be sovereign over decision-making rather than have Brussels make decisions for them. And that was the essence of the debate, and particularly those who are, such as David Cameron, the Prime Minister, who argued for Britain to remain in the European Union. They did so on the basis that to leave would cause economic devastation, not on the basis that Britain was part of a great European project of ever closer union and perhaps suggesting eventually some supranational state. I think it's really important to understand this when you hear people saying Brexit is part of a reaction to globalisation. It's nothing of the sort. Brexit came about partly because in a country, if I could put it this way, came about in a country which was never all that enthusiastic about being in the European Union in the first place. And the second thing to say about it, and it goes back to what I said earlier, is you can expect in democracies to be rewarded if you do a good job, and you can expect to be punished if you don't. And the perception in the United Kingdom, so I'm a public servant, I don't make too many judgments about whether this is right or wrong, but the perception in the United Kingdom was that two things the European Union had done had been a disaster. The first was the creation of the euro and the eurozone. So, if you're living in southern Europe, in Greece or in Spain or Portugal, you have seen huge declines in people's living standards, youth unemployment of around 50%. It's pretty hard to argue in that circumstance that the euro and the architects of the euro deserve an electoral reward when people are thrown out of work, when their pensions are cut. And in Northern Europe, Germany, Finland, Netherlands and so on, these are the countries that are paying for the euro and paying for the bailouts, lending the money, see if ever it'll be seen again, but lending the money to those countries which have encountered difficulties in southern Europe because of the structure of the model. So the perception you get looking at the eurozone from the UK is, first, it's a great thing, as the British would say, that they never joined the euro, and secondly, that the euro system itself is a bit of a disaster. And the second thing that really, I think, reflected, if I could put it this way, badly, at least electorally, was the way the European Union has handled the issue of irregular migration. Now, it doesn't, in a sense, I'm not really making an argument one way or the other here about whether I personally or the Australian government thought this was well or badly done, but the perception in the United Kingdom was that irregular immigration into the European Union was a complete shambles. The decision by Germany to take 1 million people in, 4,000 to 5,000 people drowned in the last year trying to cross the Mediterranean. The whole system looks completely chaotic. And then on top of that, there is the threat of jihadist terrorism, and there have been incidents, and Pascal referred to the one we had last week where a woman from the Adelaide Hills was affected. And the link, false or true, and a lot of it is false, by the way, but the link that many voters have made to irregular, uncontrolled immigration. And I think it's those issues that really drove what was ultimately a Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, not some reaction to globalisation. So I just leave that thought that you cannot expect rewards for performance which is seen not to be terribly good. On the morning after the Brexit vote, and David Cameron, the Prime Minister, resigned, it occurred to me that the people, amongst others, outside of the United Kingdom, the people who ought to be looking in the mirror and wondering whether they need to improve their performance were the leaders of the European Union. They have lost the second biggest country in the European Union, the country with the greatest international reach. They've lost 20% of the GDP of the European Union, and they've lost, well, they'll lose a bit over 10% of their budget, about 12%, I think, of their budget net. Yesterday was a bad day for the European Union when Theresa May finally signed the Article 50 letter and Britain left. So I suppose the other thing to say to you is, having tried to persuade you that this wasn't a reaction to globalisation, and by the way, not a reaction to a more unequal society, because over the last 10 years, the level of inequality in the United Kingdom has actually declined, not increased. And if you take the last 20 years, it's remained about the same over that 20-year period. So you are not seeing, the data demonstrates in the United Kingdom, a country becoming increasingly unequal as a result of globalisation, simply not what's happening there. So that is not the reason that people voted the way they did on June the 23rd last year. What does this mean for us? This is both good news and bad news for Australia. Let me start with the bad news and always try to be optimistic and end up with the good news. The bad news for Australia is that we have lost from the European Union the country with which we are the most like-minded, and that is obvious to you, why we are so like-minded with the United Kingdom. But it's more than that. It's a country which incorporates our approach to international issues, a country which shares our commitment to liberal market economies, that shares our commitment to a liberal international trading system. The UK has been a great champion of liberal trade within the European Union. That means now without the UK and the European Union, we'll have to invest more heavily in our relationships with countries like France. Well, the federal government granting the submarine contract to a French company is obviously going to be is proving to be very helpful there, and we'll have to invest more in our relationship with Germany and others, because if we want to influence the European Union, and we want the European Union to take note of the Indo-Pacific region, we won't be able to use the United Kingdom anymore as the vehicle through which we can express our views and exercise some influence. I think you are going to find a European Union without the United Kingdom more introverted and less transatlantic and less internationalist than it currently is, and I think that's a pity. The other country which is very outward-looking in the European Union is France. France is a country like the UK that has great global reach and influence, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nuclear weapons state. The British and the French argue about this, but I'd say the sixth biggest economy in the world might be the fifth. Je ne sais pas. But the fifth or the sixth. So, you know, France is still there. And by the way, my prediction is France will remain there. I don't think Marine Le Pen will win the election. But the European Union, nevertheless, will lose that critical global influence and that liberal influence that the British brought to bear within the European Union. On the upside, the opportunities for Australia from Brexit in relation to the UK, I think, are very positive. This will be an opportunity for us to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK, which will mean eliminating the barriers to entry into the British market that we currently confront. And a lot of those barriers are in agriculture, beef and sheep meat, horticulture and the like. not so much wine. We'll be able to continue our wine sales very strongly there. But we will be able to gain more access to the British market than we currently have as a result of negotiating a free trade agreement with the UK. And of course, they'll be able to have slightly better access. They have pretty free access to the Australian market, but slightly better access here, which means we'll be able to import particularly inputs for business from the UK into Australia at lower prices than is currently the case. So the net economic benefits will accrue to us. We also have a Britain which, even in the just short period of 9 months since the referendum vote, has become more interested in countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, of course the United States itself, than was the case before. I mean, in the past, and entirely understandably, British governments have focused very much on Europe and the European project. And now they're starting to look more globally at the outside world and what they can do with the outside world. And relationships with a country like Australia are amongst the easiest for them to navigate. So I think from Australia's point of view, there are some pluses that come out of Brexit. But I'd like to finish really where I began, and that is it is extremely important that we accurately analyse what's going on and not misanalyse what is going on. Yesterday at our Global Heads of Mission meeting, we had some discussion about Brexit, and I said pretty much what I've said this afternoon. But we also had some discussion about the election of Donald Trump. And again, a sense in the United States that the government could do better than it has been doing meant that people would, at least some voters, would turn away from the Democratic candidate, President Obama having been a Democrat, turn away from the Democratic candidate towards an alternative. And that, I'm afraid, whether you like it or not, and whatever your partisan leanings might be, and I'm a public servant, so I am free of partisan leanings nowadays. I used to have them. And gosh, coming back here, it strikes me how incredibly partisan Australians are. Great warriors for their teams. Moving away from partisan feelings, governments that perform well and institutions that perform well will be rewarded, and those that are not seen to do so well will not be. And the last piece of evidence I present to you is the British Conservative Party. Now, I would argue that there is no political party in the democratic world, should I say in the so-called Western world, which has been as successful over so many years as the British Conservative Party, the party of Disraeli, the party of Churchill, the party of Macmillan, the party of Lord Salisbury, and so on. You can go back a very, very long time, and the Conservative Party was running Britain. What do I mean by that? I mean that the British Conservative Party is one of the most elite and establishment institutions of the United Kingdom. Certainly, it is the epitome of the British establishment, the British Conservative Party. At the moment, in the opinion polls, it has a lead of between 15 and 19% over its major political opponent, the Labour Party. This is not evidence of a country which is trying to throw out an establishment. This is evidence of a country which will lean towards people who the public perceive to be delivering the goods for them and move away from people who they perceive not to be doing so. And it's not a complicated thought, that. It's as simple as that. So thank you again very much for having me today. It's great to support CEDA, of course. I hadn't realised it was 50 years old, but a great organisation. And wonderful to be back in Adelaide. Whatever concerns or otherwise you might have about South Australia, it has to be said that it is a part of the world that has the most exceptional lifestyle, and for me, it's my home. Thank you.